So recently I started replaying Skyrim, and it was initially going to be a thing I just did on stream. If you want, you can check me out at the link on screen now. We have a great time. But then this happened. I really didn't mean to let it get that far. I was going to log in and just do some grinding, get some of the more boring parts out of the way, and I just kept going. I couldn't stop myself. Just like it always does, Skyrim had me. And it got me thinking, why is that? Why is it that this decade-old game, a game that recently celebrated its literal 10th anniversary just a couple months ago, is still arguably the most enrapturing experience you can have in gaming? There are games with deeper gameplay, better stories, better AI, more immersive worlds.
Come to Dragon's Reach to discuss the ongoing hostilities, like the rest of the great warriors?
Much better voice acting, but there's only one Skyrim, and ever since I got it for Christmas in 2011 and died falling off a mountain within the first hour, it's had me in its grasp. And I think you may know why, but to explain it, I need to get some disclaimers out of the way. Number one, this is not a review. Skyrim has been reviewed to death. While I may bring up a mechanic here, a story beat there, I'm not doing so to say if they are ultimately bad or good. Any jackass can play a game and tell you what works for them and what doesn't. If you want pointless surface level critiques of media, you can listen to my shitty fucking podcast, Kingdom County Drive-In, available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify now. No, we're going a layer deeper. And as this isn't a review, I'm going to assume that you've played Skyrim, or at the very least are familiar with it. I'm not running down the Wikipedia article of Skyrim as a 2011. That's not what this video is about. You may not have 1,000 hours in it on 50 different characters, but you at least have a passing familiarity with the game, enough that I don't have to explain what it is. I may explain the mechanics, but I'm not going to bother with the little mini Wikipedia entry at the start of the video, okay? This game has been out for a decade, you know what it is, what it looks like. Ultimately, I'm not trying to sell this game to you. It's sold well over 30 million copies. It doesn't need me for that. What I'm trying to do is answer the question you may have of why this game in particular has become such a cultural mainstay. Because for some reason, this janky-ass game really resonates with people on an emotional level, and I want to know why. What was that? Why, 10 years later, I can make a reference to Bleak Falls Barrow, and you know what that is. So without further ado, let's go to Skyrim. Alright, look, I know I said I wasn't going to be reviewing the more individual elements of Skyrim, but I feel just this once it's necessary. The opening scene to Skyrim is truly iconic. I'm going to return to it later, as I feel it to be a microcosm of the Skyrim experience itself, but for now, let's just appreciate it. The whole thing is very long, but that doesn't stop it from being incredibly memorable. I've seen this sequence on the cart more times than I can count between my own playthroughs and watching other people play the game, but show this opening to even the most casual fan, and they can probably drop several quotes from it. I mean, the entire thing is even a meme at this point. It's not the first Elder Scrolls game to have the player begin as a prisoner, but it's probably the most effective utilization of the trope thus far. This is the one time in the entire game, a game that takes the average person 125 hours to finish, that the player is quite literally a captive audience, and the developers really are eager to get their money's worth out of it. In this opening scene, the player learns the basics of Skyrim's lore, the history of the dragons that drive the game's central conflict, a handful of main characters at play, not to mention the standard game tutorial of how to move, how to fight, being worked in mostly seamlessly with the intro's narrative. When do we show the player how jumping works? Well, when they have to leap across buildings after a dragon destroys the tower that they're in. After a trawl through the caverns beneath Helgen, where the player gets the chance to experiment with different playstyles, we are now set loose in the world. From here, anything is possible. You can follow whoever you accompanied out of Helgen to Riverwood, or you can take your own path. Two people can play this game and have radically different experiences of it. Here are just a handful of the options on where to go from this point. Follow your companion to Riverwood, thus continuing the main quest line in which you will become the prophesied Dragonborn who fights back against the return of the dragons. Take your companion's advice and sign up for their associated faction, thus instigating the Civil War quest line. Go to the nearest inn and seek mercenary work for some spare gold. Sign up with the companions in Whiterun. Sign up with the Thieves Guild in Riften. Visit the Mage College in Winterhold. Join the Dark Brotherhood. Join the Bard's College. Start the Dawnguard DLC and become a badass vampire hunter or vampire lord if that's more your thing. Explore the world, picking up any of the hundreds of side quests littered around the map, hunting Daedra, battling monsters, enhancing your skills, and becoming the best blacksmith or alchemist that Skyrim has ever seen. Or you can do none of it, if you wish. Your entire experience within Skyrim could hypothetically be chopping wood at a day job, getting married, having kids, and living out your life in one of the game's strongholds. Once you leave Helgen, the game doesn't really ask anything in particular of you. Dragons don't even start attacking until a few quests into the main storyline, so if you wish, you can cast aside the entire Dragonborn mantle that the game rests its laurels on, and live roughly however you wish. You can just be the one prisoner that got lucky. And if you're open to modding the game, you don't even have to be that. Skyrim is not the first game to offer the player this degree of openness. I mean, hell, Minecraft launched before Skyrim did. The game's combat is equally as freeing. Skyrim's combat was one of the few points of criticism when the game came out, as on a surface level it's just click to swing sword, but I would argue that this degree of simplicity is necessary to what the game is trying to accomplish. People view the combat as part of a larger issue where they think Skyrim is stripping away RPG mechanics to be more accessible to a wider audience. And I'm sure that was part of it, but Skyrim's combat in particular is a good example of what I'm talking about with the game's freedom. If it was any more complex, it would no longer be as malleable to the player's playstyle. Keeping it simple means pretty much any method of play is easy to pick up and learn, encouraging experimentation and combinations of different styles of fighting, while also ensuring that no one style really vastly outweighs the others in terms of pure effectiveness. Skyrim's skill trees have also become a meme, but they function remarkably well at the cost of being somewhat arbitrary. You'll see what I mean in a moment, but for now I'm going to refresh your memory of them. Skyrim's skill trees are divided into 3 categories: Thief, Mage, and Warrior. The game hammers this division home, as early in the game you pass by a trio of standing stones with the same labels, and whichever stone you pick gives you an XP buff in learning the skills under the same category. Pick Warrior like I usually do because I love the taste of crayon. Well, my friend, you now learn warrior skills at a slightly faster rate, making you more adept earlier on in heavy armor, shields, 1 and 2-handed weapons, etc. You would be forgiven for assuming this is essentially Skyrim's way of picking a class. I know because this is what I thought it was when I first played Skyrim, but I also thought the plural of orc was orcses because that's what Gollum called them in Lord of the Rings, so safe to say, I was kind of an idiot. Also, because the only other RPG I'd really played at the same time was World of Warcraft, where the class divides were incredibly stark, with hard limitations on what weapons you can use and what armor you can wear, not to mention what abilities you have access to. This made sense as it's an MMO, but for a single-player game, these limitations are ultimately only there to hamper the player's creativity. See, the Standing Stones are a facade. There are more Standing Stones in the world, with buffs ranging from the Steed Stone, which allows the player to carry more weight, to the Tower Stone, which allows the player to automatically unlock any lock once a day, despite their skill level and lockpicking. Both of these are a far cry from having an actual class. You can bicker about their usefulness in the comments, which I encourage you to do, but they are present and incredibly varied in their effects. You can even change which stone you have active at any time by revisiting them. So if you start the game as a warrior but get tired of hearing all that armor clanging around all the time, you can always go back and pick another, or try any of the other Standing Stones. I'm personally pretty partial to the Lover's Stone. It allows increased XP gain in every skill. All this to show that no matter what choices you make in regards to what skills to level, you are ultimately never cut off from any other options. You can be a battle mage that swings swords and casts spells at the same time. You can be a mage that likes to sneak around. You can be a thief that wields a great sword. The game really doesn't give a fuck. This is why I don't understand when people get angry that Skyrim has fewer classes than previous Elder Scrolls games, because by reducing the amount of classes from Oblivion, Skyrim ultimately opens the player up to even more possibilities. You don't have to select Bard from the list, you can just be a Bard. And when you get bored of it, you can switch. In fact, there are very few decisions in Skyrim that are actually consequential or that lock you out of other paths. This may seem like a bad thing for an RPG, but since I'm assuming you've played Skyrim, you know what I'm talking about and how it really impacts you as a player. Unlike its contemporary RPGs, say Dragon Age, where the player's decision on both a moral and a narrative level directly impact plot points and the player's relationship with other characters, Skyrim has no real alterations to its story, only enough to be internally consistent with the world the player has helped create. I'm sure people will be able to point to specific instances where the narrative changes to accommodate player decisions, but I'm painting with a large brush here. Face it, while most video game protagonists are no stranger to holstering massive amounts of responsibility, Skyrim's Dovahkiin is a uniquely powerful entity, not only literally, but within the very fabric of Skyrim as a nation. It is entirely possible to not only be the prophesied the one who will save the world from dragons, but to become the Archmage of the College of Winterhold, the leader of the Thieves Guild, the leader of the Dark Brotherhood, the leader of the Dawn Guard, one of the top advisors of the Companions, a high-ranking soldier who was personally responsible for killing the leader of the opposing army, the wielder of an assortment of legendary artifacts and weapons, and one of Skyrim's top blacksmiths, alchemists, and now fisherman. If you play Mass Effect, most of the more memorable moments in that game will be incredibly personal to the player, yet are still things hardwired into the game. You may feel your romancing of Liara is special, but that romance is still a scripted event, just one that you are able to sweet talk yourself into. To me, the most memorable points of Skyrim are more low-key than full-blown subplots. As an example, there are a lot of people in Mass Effect 2 who can die as a result of your actions, but it's really only in the game as one of a couple outcomes. In Skyrim, who lives and who dies is really up to the player. Apart from children, there are very few essential NPCs who are unkillable. By the way, the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, which has all 3 games remastered for new consoles, is playable right now on Game Pass. You literally have no excuse not to play it. Those games are masterpieces. Thank you. And that works for Mass Effect, where the developers are trying to tell a very specific story with very specific outcomes to very specific actions chosen by the player. But Skyrim is a lot different. Hardly any of these things are actually coded into the game as specific events. For example, I stole from someone, and a few days later I was attacked by a Dark Brotherhood assassin, having been contracted by them. It's a very basic thing in the grand scheme of things, but it almost feels like a prototypical version of Red Dead Redemption 2's system of building relationships with any and all NPCs in the world, or in a sense, even Shadow of War's Nemesis system. Don't get me wrong, Skyrim's AI is not smart enough to actually build foundations with the player on the degree that Shadow of War or Red Dead Redemption 2 is, but my point being, the game punished me for something that I did, and even if only very temporarily, I was given the illusion that my actions had consequences. For the record, I'm not trying to hate on Mass Effect or Dragon Age or any other story-oriented RPG. Mass Effect 2, despite having not played it for a literal decade, holy shit, is one of my favorite games ever made. I still, 10 years later, remember every death from my suicide mission at the end of the game. And that's a testament to how well those characters were done, that every sacrifice on their part felt so real and personal to me, because at the end of the day, it was my own failings that led to that outcome. Even though on a cognitive level, I'm aware that those deaths were basically just the product of a if statement somewhere in that game's code. I'm talking about Mass Effect 2 so much because in a lot of ways, it's kind of the antithesis to Skyrim. They're both really well-made games, but Mass Effect 2 is very choice-heavy in how the player approaches the game, whereas decisions like who to send where and the suicide mission with a baked-in outcome at the end of it, that kind of thing doesn't really exist in Skyrim, yet at the same time, it doesn't seem to matter. I'm not saying that there aren't necessarily moral questions that Skyrim asks of the player, or decisions that the player has to make. The Parthenax issue partway through the game springs to mind, as does the red guard lady that you can either turn in to the people looking for her or spare her, even though it's a little hazy as to who exactly is the good guy and who's the bad guy in that situation. I personally side with the lady. You may see things differently. My point, though, is that these things don't really branch out and inform other aspects of the game. They are mostly proxies for the player deciding what kind of reward they want. And even the game's few attempts at giving the player the idea that they are making a consequential choice in Skyrim aren't really the moments the player remembers. Truthfully, I forgot you had the option to kill Parthenites. That's why it sounds like I'm rambling a little in this segment, is because I forgot about this and wanted to talk about it very briefly in this section of the video. These little moments that are actually hardwired into Skyrim, that are actually scripted events that give the player a specific, direct, explicit choice, these aren't what sticks with you emotionally about this game. They're the little things that rise organically that the game developers may have never even experienced for themselves while making it. It's having Faendal follow you around for 40 hours, only to have him die in some random Dwemer ruins halfway in. That is what sticks with you. Sure, you can reload, I guess technically you can reload any other game where your actions can lead to an NPC's death, but the fact that you would want to or care, despite extremely limited characterization from the game, is rather unique. Most of Skyrim's voice cast is poor, and even then most voice actors play multiple characters. This degree of giving a shit about an NPC when you have every reason on a meta level of not is a rather unique quality to Skyrim. Todd Howard did it. He did the impossible. He put in the minimum amount of effort and got the biggest reward out of it. All the emotional connection of a story-oriented action RPG on the likes of BioWare while using like 12 voice actors. Any more rigidity in game design would end up breaking the illusion. Bravo, Todd. It just works. As I said near the start of the video, Skyrim isn't perfect, not on a design level and certainly not on a technical level. And here's where we get back to the intro. I lauded it heavily earlier, and while it is something of a
masterclass in script economy,
it's far from being technically polished, especially upon release. The developer of the game detailed the struggles of making the cart scene work on Twitter, saying the following.
So, I have a story about the Skyrim intro and how hard game development is. That intro is famous now, but back then it was just that one thing that we had to keep working and working on forever. I lost track of how many times I've seen that cart ride, easily hundreds. See, the issue with that cart ride is that it's not just a cart on rails. That cart is physically simulated. Why, you ask? Good question. So, anyways, this means that all kinds of things would cause the cart to start to freak out and fly off the road. Maybe the road was too bumpy, maybe there was just a physics bug. Maybe somebody accidentally put a rock too close to the road. The cart had a path it wanted to follow, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a path it could follow. There's a big difference. Well, one time riding that cart yet again, the cart starts to shake violently and all of a sudden, whoosh, the car goes up into the sky like a rocket ship, like way up there. Something was telling that cart just to fuck right off and to get off that road. But the thing is, it wasn't happening every time. Nobody knew what was going on at first. So it turns out there was another bug where the bee in the game couldn't be picked up. So then some potions couldn't be made. That bug got fixed. Only the type of collision put on the bee didn't just let it get picked up. It also made it collide into things. Meaning, that bee was an immovable force of nature if it ever happened to cross the path of the cart. The cart wanted to move down the road, the bee did not want to move. So the cart goes up. So game development is hard. Every time you fix one thing, you might be breaking another. This is especially true about open world games. Yet, that interplay of all the systems is what ends up making them all super interesting.
See what I mean now about that cart ride being a microcosm of Skyrim? In Andrew Reiner of Game Informer's review of Skyrim way back in 2011, he said of the opening,
"The intensity that's supposed to accompany this scene is stripped away by robotic character animations, confusion over who is talking at any given point, and uncomfortable lulls in the pacing. Making this scene feel real requires just as much imagination as a Dungeons and Dragons setting."
Which, as a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons, kind of got me thinking, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the hook. I mean, I can play Dungeons and Dragons and get super invested in what's going on. And it's not like I'm playing with Matt Mercer, I'm playing with my loser friends. Half the time, I'm the DM and I know what's happening, and I still get into it. But in Skyrim, a character with some stilted animations is a bridge too far. These characters in the world take a lot of imagination. For some, I guess it might be a little too much, but if you know that feeling that I mentioned, that inexplicable draw to this decade-old buggy RPG, I really think this is it. Skyrim is bursting at the seams with content, with new side quests around every corner, but admit it, your fondest memories of the game are little ones. It's that first climb to the throat of the world. It's that first time you take the steps to Bleak Falls Barrow. But it's also the memories between them. When this game came out, I had friends that played it religiously, and every day at school they would tell me about all the adventures they had in it, and we'd all compare experiences with each other. And judging by who I've talked to and what I've seen online, this kind of post-game storytelling about Skyrim is a pretty universal experience. Don't get me wrong, people do it with a lot of games, but in those instances they tend to boil down to a funny glitch or a cool kill. Well, that's not the case with Skyrim. Do you ever remember telling or hearing a Skyrim story about a quest, especially a main quest? No, you don't. It's the creative way you decide to kill Sven. It's the first time 2 dragons attack at once. It's the death of a companion, or a cool new spell you find, or just stumbling into Windhelm and spending a night at the inn. It's the inventive ways you make money, the process of building your home in Hearthfire. None of this, apart from the ability to do so, is necessarily in the game's systems. They're not the result of a black and white decision, a choice between A, B, or maybe C that's basically just a more sarcastic A. They arise organically, allowing each playthrough of the game, even though you're going through familiar territory, to feel wholly unique. I think this is what lures people back. Not just that each playthrough is different, that the same world is experienced differently each time. What characters you get attached to, the Skyrim you help shape, the legacy your Dovahkiin story leaves in your head. Skyrim might be stiff and clunky, but so are action figures, and we all played with those growing up. They let you enact your wildest fantasies with the most base elements. The connection to this game and the repeated draw to it is because the imagination fills in the gaps. Skyrim is essentially a massive playset, one where you're free to act out the story of your choosing. Your character and the world surrounding them are blank slates upon which the game gives you the tools to paint whatever you want. And the game is just smart enough to play along. It's basically the best kind of D&D player. Up for anything, so long as that thing is some form of life within a Vikinger-inspired fantasy hellhole. But hey, it can't be everything at once. But it is something to all of us. Thank you to Colorblind and to Chickentacos for their vocal talents. It's much appreciated from both of you. Make sure to check Colorblind out. In particular, he also does content, mainly Lego building videos and stuff, live streams, that kind of thing. And sometimes I'm there, so make sure to go like and subscribe to him, and like and subscribe to me too while you're here. Make sure to tell me about some of your favorite Skyrim memories down in the comments. I appreciate you guys for sticking around. The next video should be out in a couple weeks. And yeah, thanks.